The ocean doesn't give up its secrets easily, but that night, something beneath a broken dock refused to stay hidden. A struggling veteran returned to a rotting pier no one wanted and found a wounded German shepherd waiting in the dark. But here's what doesn't make sense. Why did the dog keep staring at the water, like it knew something was buried below? Why were there metal sounds at midnight, in a place no ships had docked for years? And if his brother's death was just an accident, why did someone come back during a storm to steal what was hidden? Some secrets don't sink. They wait. Before we uncover the truth beneath that pier, I hope you're safe and doing well tonight. If stories of loyalty and second chances matter to you, please subscribe and join us. Thank you for being here. The Gulf wind moved low and restless across the water, carrying the smell of salt, rust, and old storms. Clouds hung heavy over the Louisiana coastline, and the tide rolled in with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the sea itself was thinking about something it had not yet decided to reveal. Michael Hayes stood at the edge of the warped wooden pier and felt the boards shift slightly beneath his boots. He was 48 years old, 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, though age and long years of labor had carved a certain weariness into his frame. His dark brown hair was cut short but uneven, silver threading at the temples. A trimmed beard framed a jaw that had once been sharper, harder, before life sanded down its edges. His hazel eyes carried a constant watchfulness, the kind that did not come from paranoia but from experience. War had trained him to notice everything. Peace had not taught him how to stop. He wore a faded olive work jacket over a gray thermal shirt, sleeves pushed back to reveal forearms lined with old scars and sun-darkened skin. His jeans were worn thin at the knees, and his boots, once military-issued, had been resoled twice. He moved with the quiet steadiness of someone who understood pain and chose not to discuss it. Michael had returned from overseas 7 years earlier, not as a hero, not as a broken man either, but as something in between. He had worked odd jobs ever since, fixing boat engines, welding cracked hulls, repairing anything with a motor that coughed or rattled. It was honest work, though rarely enough to keep ahead of debt. Banks were patient only until they weren't. People were the same way. 3 days ago, he had received a call from a parish office informing him that his older brother, Daniel Hayes, had been found dead near the docks. Official report: accidental fall during night repairs. Case closed quickly. Too quickly. Daniel had left him this pier. The locals called it Driftwood Point. Most of them refused to dock here anymore. Too many accidents, they said. Too much trouble. Michael did not believe in curses. He believed in causes. The pier itself stretched 50 yards into the shallow water, its planks warped and gray from years of sun and salt. Rusted cleats lined the edges like teeth. The small shed near the entrance leaned slightly to one side, its tin roof dented and rattling whenever the wind picked up. A faded sign still hung crookedly from 2 nails: Hayes Dock Repair. The letters were barely readable beneath layers of peeling paint. He stepped inside the shed first. Tools lay scattered across a wooden bench: wrenches, coiled rope, a handheld torch. A coffee mug sat near the edge, a dried ring staining the wood beneath it. Daniel had left in a hurry, or been interrupted. That thought settled heavy in Michael's chest. Daniel had always been the lighter one between them, taller by an inch, thinner, with sandy blonde hair that never quite obeyed gravity. He laughed easily, spoke to strangers without hesitation, trusted people faster than Michael ever could. After their father died in a refinery accident years ago, Daniel had stayed near the coast, fixing boats and building small charters. Michael had left for the army. They had chosen different ways of surviving grief. Michael stepped back out onto the pier and crouched near a section where several boards were darker than the rest. Saltwater stains, he assumed at first. Then he heard it. A faint scraping sound. Not from the wind, not from the shed, from beneath the pier. He straightened slowly and listened. The tide was rising, water pushing against the wooden supports with a hollow thud. Then, between the rhythm of waves, came another sound. Metal touching metal. Soft, deliberate. Michael moved toward the edge and knelt, peering down between the planks. The water was murky, shifting green and brown. Nothing obvious. No floating debris large enough to make that sound. A low, strained breath came from behind him. He turned. Under the far corner of the pier, half hidden between two support beams, lay a dog. The animal was large, though thin enough that its ribs pressed sharply against its hide. A German shepherd, roughly 6 years old by Michael's estimate. The coat was the classic black and tan, though matted with dried salt and mud. One ear stood upright, the other bent slightly at the tip, as if it had once been torn and healed unevenly. A faint scar cut across the bridge of its muzzle. Its amber eyes were alert, not wild, but calculating. The dog did not growl. It did not bark. It watched him the way soldiers watch unfamiliar territory, ready but restrained. Michael crouched slowly, palms open, his movements deliberate. "Easy," he said, his voice low and steady. It was the same tone he had once used to calm frightened civilians in foreign streets. Calm traveled through the voice before it reached the ears. The dog tried to stand and faltered, favoring its right hind leg. There was dried blood along the joint, not fresh, but recent enough. Not the result of random fighting. Clean cut. Controlled. Michael's jaw tightened. Someone had hurt this animal. He stepped closer, close enough now to see the faint indentation in the fur around the dog's neck. A collar had been there once. Something heavier than a normal tag. "Where'd you come from?" he murmured. The dog's tail shifted once against the wood. Not submission, not aggression. A question of its own. Michael removed his jacket and folded it, sliding it slowly toward the animal. The dog sniffed the fabric, eyes never leaving his face. After a long moment, it lowered its head slightly, accepting the warmth. It took him nearly 15 minutes to coax the shepherd fully into the open. When he finally managed to lift the dog, he felt the weight of bone beneath thin muscle. This animal had once been powerful. It would be again, if given the chance. Inside the shed, Michael cleaned the wound with bottled water and antiseptic from his truck. The dog endured the process without complaint, though its muscles tensed at every touch. Discipline. Training. "You're not Stray," Michael muttered quietly. When he finished bandaging the leg, he placed a metal bowl of water on the floor. The shepherd drank carefully, not gulping. Even hungry, it did not rush. Michael leaned back against the wall and studied the animal. There was intelligence in those eyes. Memory. Loss. "I guess you need a name," he said after a while. He looked toward the water beyond the open shed door. The tide had risen another few inches, pushing higher beneath the boards. Shadow, he decided. You showed up out of nowhere and won't leave. The dog's ears twitched at the sound. Shadow. As evening settled in, the sky darkened to deep violet. The wind shifted colder, carrying the promise of a coming storm offshore. Michael lit a small lantern inside the shed. The soft glow spilled across the floorboards, catching the grain of old wood and the restless flicker in the dog's eyes. Then Shadow stood, slowly, carefully. He limped toward the doorway and positioned himself at the edge of the pier, staring down between two specific planks. His body went rigid, head angled, ears forward. Michael followed and crouched beside him. What is it? The scraping sound returned, clearer now beneath the rising tide. Metal. Shadow did not bark. He did not move. He simply stared at the dark water below, muscles tight as wire. Michael felt a familiar chill spread across his spine. Not fear, recognition. The kind that came when instinct aligned with fact. Something was down there. Not driftwood. Not accident. Something placed. The tide continued to rise, swallowing the lower beams inch by inch. The sound faded beneath the water's weight. Shadow remained motionless, eyes locked on that hidden point. Michael rested a hand lightly against the dog's neck. The fur was coarse but warm beneath his palm. He stared into the murky water and felt, for the first time since stepping onto this pier, that Daniel's death might not have been as simple as the report claimed. Above them, the first distant roll of thunder echoed across the gulf. Shadow exhaled slowly, but did not look away, and beneath the old pier where forgotten things drifted ashore, something waited in the dark water, silent, hidden, and very much alive. The next morning rose slow and gray over Driftwood Point, the gulf lying deceptively calm beneath a sky the color of old tin. Michael Hayes was already awake before the sun cleared the horizon, sitting on an overturned crate inside the shed with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands. Shadow lay near the doorway, head resting on his paws, but eyes open, alert. The dog had slept lightly, waking at every shift of tide. Even injured, he had positioned himself facing the water. Not the road. The water. Michael stepped back onto the pier and crouched near the same warped planks where the sound had come from the night before. In daylight, the boards looked ordinary, aged, salt-eaten, slightly darker, where years of tide had licked at the grain. But when he stood still and let the wind settle, he heard it again. A faint, deliberate scrape, metal against metal. Not random, not debris. Shadow rose immediately, his ears locked forward, his entire posture changed, muscles tightening beneath his dampened coat. He moved to the exact section of boards and stood rigid, staring down through the narrow gap between planks. You hear it too, Michael muttered. He fetched a pry bar from the shed and wedged it carefully between two boards. The nails resisted at first, then gave with a groan. He lifted one plank enough to widen the gap and lay flat, peering down into the murky green water. The tide was halfway in, current slow but steady. At first he saw only drifting silt. Then a shape. Something rectangular. It hung suspended beneath the pier, about 3 feet below the surface, secured between two support beams. A steel container roughly the size of a large storage case, not old scrap. The edges were straight, corners reinforced, and running from it to one of the beams was a cable, new, silver against the weathered wood. Michael's heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. That was how he knew this was real. When danger was imagined, the pulse jumped. When it was confirmed, everything sharpened. He stood and pulled off his jacket. "Stay," he told Shadow. The dog did not obey. Michael dove. The water closed over him in a thick, muted silence. Visibility dropped fast, but the container was close enough to feel before fully seeing. He swam toward it, fingers brushing cold steel. The surface bore faint scratches and a partially torn identification plate. He ran his hand over the cable, recently fastened. Before he could examine further, a dark shape moved beside him. Shadow. The shepherd had slipped in after him, ignoring the injured leg. He circled the container once, nose brushing the steel. Then he bit down on the loose fragment of metal hanging from the torn plate and ripped it free with a sharp jerk of his head. They surfaced together. Back on the pier, Michael dragged himself onto the boards, lungs burning. Shadow hauled himself up seconds later, water streaming from his coat. He dropped the jagged piece of steel at Michael's knees. Michael picked it up. The insignia was clear despite the corrosion. An eagle's wing folded sharply over a lightning bolt, encircled by a thin, incomplete ring. Not Army, not Navy, not any branch that carried rank patches or public record. He had seen it once, years ago. On a crate that arrived without documentation at a desert outpost overseas. The kind of shipment that came with no insignia on uniforms and no answers in briefings. The kind you were told not to ask about. Shadow stood close now, watching Michael's face instead of the water. The dog's amber eyes reflected something close to recognition, not of the symbol, but of Michael's reaction to it. "You've seen this before too, haven't you?" Michael murmured. A truck engine sounded from the shoreline. Michael turned. A dusty white pickup rolled slowly down the gravel path leading to the pier. It stopped 20 yards short. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. Sarah Delgado. She was tall and lean, early 40s, with sharp features and auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail. Her skin was pale but sun-freckled across the cheeks. Thin-framed glasses sat on a face that always seemed to be calculating something. Sarah ran the small marine supply store in town. Ropes, bait, engine oil, practical things. She had known Daniel since they were teenagers and had once dated him briefly before deciding friendship suited them better. She was not easily frightened, but she was not reckless either. She walked halfway down the pier, boots careful on the warped boards. Her eyes moved from Michael to the open plank to the metal fragment in his hand. "So it's true," she said quietly. Michael did not pretend ignorance. "You knew something was under here." She hesitated only a second. "Daniel mentioned trucks at night. No lights, no logos. They'd stop near the end of the pier when the tide was high." Michael felt his jaw tighten. "And you didn't tell anyone?" "Who would I tell?" Her voice carried more frustration than fear. "The sheriff? The same sheriff who said Daniel slipped and fell without checking the water?" Shadow shifted slightly, positioning himself between Sarah and the open plank. Not aggressive. Protective. Sarah crouched, keeping her distance from the dog. She studied the insignia in Michael's hand. The color drained slightly from her face. "I saw that mark once," she said. "On a crate in the back of one of those trucks." Michael's pulse remained steady. "You're sure?" She nodded. "Daniel thought it was smuggling, something big. He said the deeper channel by your pier was perfect for offloading from offshore boats without anyone noticing." The scraping sound came again from below, louder this time, All three of them froze. Michael stepped to the edge and looked down. The container had shifted slightly with the rising tide. It was not abandoned scrap. It was active, used, maintained. Shadow let out a low, controlled breath. Not a growl, but a warning rumble in his chest. Sarah rose slowly. "You need to let this go," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "This isn't just backwater smuggling." Michael slid the metal fragment into his pocket and replaced the plank loosely over the opening. "It stopped being something I could let go when my brother died." The truck engine from the road started again, not Sarah's. Another vehicle, unseen beyond the bend in the gravel path. Michael looked up. A dark SUV idled at the far edge of the trees, tinted windows hiding whoever sat inside. It remained there for 5 long seconds. Then it reversed and disappeared back toward town. Sarah swallowed. "They know you're here." Shadow turned toward the direction the SUV had gone, ears high, body still. He memorized scents the way some men memorized maps. Michael stared at the empty path. "Good," he said quietly. "Then they know I'm not leaving." Below them, the tide continued to rise. The container shifted once more, steel brushing against beam with a muted, deliberate scrape. Not drifting, not forgotten, waiting. The SUV returned the next afternoon. It did not idle this time. It drove straight down the gravel path and stopped at the mouth of the pier as if the driver had every right to be there. Michael was beneath a small outboard engine on the workbench, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands blackened with grease. Shadow lay near the open doorway, head lifted before the engine even cut off. The dog did not bark. He rose slowly, weight shifting forward, eyes fixed on the vehicle. 3 men stepped out. The first was tall and narrow-shouldered, early 40s, with neatly parted dark hair and a face too composed to be accidental. His skin was pale, almost indoor pale, and he wore a light gray button-down shirt tucked cleanly into pressed khaki trousers. No wedding ring, no visible scars. His expression was polite in a way that felt rehearsed. The second man was broader, mid-30s, thick forearms visible beneath rolled sleeves. His beard was trimmed short and squared along the jaw. He moved with the heavy, confident gait of someone accustomed to physical intimidation. His eyes scanned the pier not with curiosity but with assessment. The third stayed near the SUV, older, late 50s perhaps, balding with a fringe of silver hair around the sides of his skull. He wore dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. His posture was relaxed, but not careless. He had the look of a man who had spent years observing operations rather than executing them. The tall man stepped forward first. "Mr. Hayes?" His voice was smooth, neutral, educated. Michael wiped his hands on a rag and walked out into the light. "That depends." The man offered a small smile. "My name is Gregory Walsh. We represent Coastal Renewal Initiative. We're conducting environmental restoration projects along this stretch of shoreline." He extended a hand. Michael did not take it. Gregory's smile did not fade. "We understand this pier has fallen into disrepair. Our company would be willing to purchase the property at a premium, above market value." "How much above?" Michael asked flatly. Gregory glanced at the broader man beside him, then back at Michael. "Enough to make relocation comfortable." Shadow moved closer to Michael's side, posture upright, ears forward. The broader man's gaze shifted briefly to the dog, calculating. Michael folded the rag slowly. "You're restoring the shoreline," he said, "but this pier sits over deep channel water. No marshland, no erosion issue." Gregory's eyes flickered, only for a second. "Our assessment indicates potential contamination risk. We'd prefer to handle it privately." "From what?" "Old fuel storage, unregulated dumping." Michael stepped forward until he stood at the edge of the pier, forcing Gregory to close the distance. "My brother ran this dock for 12 years. You're saying he was dumping something?" Gregory's tone remained calm. "We're saying we'd like to resolve the matter amicably." The older man by the SUV spoke for the first time. His voice was lower, roughened by years of cigarettes. "Accidents happen on unstable structures." Michael's jaw tightened. He looked at the man carefully now. Beneath the sunglasses, faint lines radiated from the corners of his eyes, creased from habitual squinting, not laughter. There was a scar near his left temple, partially hidden by thinning hair. Military, private security, hard to tell. "You here to buy?" Michael said evenly. "Or to warn?" Gregory let the silence stretch. "We're here to offer an opportunity." Michael shook his head once. "Not interested." The broader man shifted his weight, boots grinding against the gravel. For a moment it seemed he might step forward. Gregory raised a subtle hand, stopping him. "That's unfortunate," Gregory replied. "We'll give you a few days to reconsider." They returned to the SUV without another word. The engine roared, and the vehicle disappeared back toward town. Michael remained still long after the dust settled. Shadow's body remained rigid until the last sound of tires faded. "They're not environmental," Michael murmured. "They're invested." That night, the air grew thick again. No storm, just pressure. Michael worked late reinforcing one of the outer beams, sweat rolling down his back despite the cooler dark. Shadow patrolled the perimeter of the pier in slow, controlled arcs. The first sign something was wrong came from silence. The usual distant hum of highway traffic beyond town had faded. Even the insects seemed muted. Then the snap of rope. Michael spun toward the water. His small aluminum boat, Daniel's old skiff, had drifted 10 feet from the dock. Tether lines severed cleanly. Not frayed. Cut. He ran to the edge and grabbed the remaining rope, pulling the boat back by hand. His eyes scanned the shoreline. Footprints, fresh, not bare, heavy tread. 2 different sizes. Shadow growled low this time. Not loud, but sharp enough to carry meaning. He bolted toward the shed. Metal clanged inside. Michael grabbed a wrench and followed. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside, tools lay scattered across the floor. The engine he had been repairing sat cracked open, wiring deliberately yanked free. "Damn it," he breathed. A shadow moved beyond the far end of the pier. Shadow lunged. Michael reached the doorway in time to see the dog launch himself toward a figure sprinting toward the tree line. The intruder was tall, dressed in dark clothing, face obscured by a cap pulled low. He moved with trained efficiency, not stumbling over uneven ground. Shadow caught him briefly, jaws snapping onto fabric at the back of his jacket. The man twisted hard, striking downward with something metallic. Shadow yelped sharply but did not release immediately. A second blow forced him back. The intruder broke free and vanished into the trees, where another engine ignited seconds later. Michael reached Shadow as the distant vehicle sped away. The dog stood, breathing hard. blood matted fresh along his shoulder. Not deep, but deliberate. Michael knelt beside him, hands steady despite the rage tightening in his chest. "You're not a stray," he said quietly. "You move too clean. You don't hesitate." Inside the shed, under brighter light, he cleaned the new wound. As he parted the fur along Shadow's neck to check for deeper injury, his fingers paused. Beneath the thick coat, barely visible against the skin, was a faint circular indentation. Not from a normal collar. The mark was too uniform, too centered. He traced it gently. The dog did not flinch. A tracking collar, or something heavier. Tactical grade. Michael leaned back on his heels, staring at the animal. Memory aligned with observation. The disciplined swimming. The controlled aggression. The recognition in the dog's eyes when he had seen the insignia. "Who did you belong to?" he whispered. Shadow held his gaze without blinking. Outside, the tide shifted again. Beneath the pier, steel brushed wood once more. Michael rose slowly, stepping back to the doorway. The cut rope, the sabotaged engine, the footprints, the men offering to buy him out. This was no warning shot. It was escalation. He walked to the edge of the pier and looked down at the dark water where the container hung suspended. "You didn't just stumble here," he said quietly to Shadow. "You were sent." The dog moved beside him, body aligned with his stance, eyes fixed on the same invisible point below. In the trees beyond the gravel path, unseen but certain, someone was watching. And beneath the old dock where silence was being purchased, the truth waited, guarded by steel, shadow, and a dog that had once belonged to something far bigger than this forgotten pier. By the time the sun dipped behind the low marshland, the pier felt less like property and more like contested ground. Michael Hayes stood at the edge of Driftwood Point long after the men from Coastal Renewal had disappeared and the sabotage had been cleaned as best it could be. Shadow rested beside him, shoulder freshly bandaged, eyes alert despite exhaustion. The dog's breathing was steady again. Whatever he had once been trained for, he had not forgotten it. Michael had not slept. Instead, he had watched the tide patterns, timing the rise and fall with the precision of someone accustomed to observing moving targets. The steel container beneath the pier shifted most when the tide turned, but something else lay deeper, slightly beyond the central beams. That was where Shadow kept staring. Not at the suspended box, beyond it. At dawn, with the tide at its lowest, Michael stripped down to a black thermal shirt and secured a dive light around his wrist. The Gulf water was murky, but at low tide visibility improved by inches. Inches would have to be enough. He crouched near Shadow and pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's. "You stay on the boards this time." Shadow did not argue. He simply held Michael's gaze, then stepped back, but remained poised at the edge. Michael dove. The cold struck sharper than the day before. He swam past the steel container, ignoring it now, angling deeper toward the darker shape partially hidden behind debris and old fishing net. As his eyes adjusted, the outline emerged. Not scrap. Not driftwood. A small vessel. It had been sunk deliberately. The hull bore no visible name. Paint scraped clean. Fishing net and broken lobster traps had been arranged carefully to disguise it as wreckage. One side of the hull was cracked open, not from impact, but from controlled breach. Michael swam closer, running his hand along the wood. It was newer than the surrounding debris, less than a year underwater. A cable ran from the stern toward one of the pier supports above, hidden in the shadows. That was the anchor point for the container. The container was not the origin. The wreck was. He moved toward the opening in the hull and slipped inside. The interior was tight, silt swirling with each movement. A metal bracket had been welded across the frame, fitted with reinforced hooks. This was no abandoned fishing boat. It had been converted into a staging hold. His dive light swept across the floorboards, coiled steel cable, 2 heavy-duty cargo hooks, a pulley system bolted into the inner ribs. Then he saw it. Wedged into a compartment near the bow was a waterproof case, matte black, military grade. Michael forced it loose and kicked upward toward air. When he surfaced, Shadow was already pacing. The dog exhaled sharply when Michael pulled himself onto the boards, with the case strapped to his forearm. Back inside the shed, Michael dried the exterior and opened the latches. Inside lay 3 items: a folded laminated coastal map marked with red coordinates, a small leather-bound notebook swollen slightly from moisture but intact, and a single sheet of paper, folded twice. Michael unfolded the paper first. The handwriting stopped him cold. It was Daniel's. The letters were angular, pressed hard into the page the way Daniel had always written when he was agitated. Don't let them bring another shipment to shore. No signature, no date, but unmistakable. Michael felt the air leave his lungs slowly, like pressure venting from a sealed chamber. Shadow stepped closer, nose brushing the edge of the paper before lifting to study Michael's face. Michael set the note aside and opened the notebook. Inside were coded entries, dates, tide times, numbers that aligned with the map's red markings. Several entries had been crossed out. The last few pages were written more hurriedly, lines compressed, ink darker. One entry stood out. Deep channel operational again. Offload window, 0200 to 0315. Gregory present. Michael's jaw tightened. Gregory Walsh. The polite man with pressed khakis. He turned to the map. Red circles marked offshore coordinates roughly 2 miles out. A dotted line traced a path from those coordinates through the deeper water that passed directly beneath Driftwood Point. The same channel Daniel had mentioned to Sarah. A vehicle engine sounded faintly from the road again. Michael froze. Shadow moved to the doorway, silent. A different truck this time. Older, rusted fenders. The engine cut and a door slammed. Footsteps approached the shed. Michael stepped outside just as Sheriff Tom Weller came into view. Weller was in his early 50s, tall but softening at the waist. His uniform shirt stretched slightly at the buttons. His sandy hair had thinned over the years, and deep lines cut down from the corners of his mouth to his jaw. He had been a high school quarterback once, local hero before a knee injury ended any scholarship hopes. He carried himself with the authority of someone who believed in his role, but was tired of defending it. Heard there was trouble here last night, Weller said, scanning the pier. His eyes lingered briefly on the bandage along Shadow's shoulder. Dog looks like he's been through something. He has, Michael replied evenly. Weller stepped closer, boots creaking against the boards. You planning to report vandalism? I might. The sheriff's gaze shifted toward the water. You know, Daniel's death was unfortunate, but it was an accident. Michael held his stare. You ever check beneath the pier? Weller's expression hardened slightly. We did a surface inspection. Michael stepped aside just enough to reveal the waterproof case on the workbench inside the shed. He did not open it. Not yet. "There's more under there than warped wood," Michael said quietly. Weller's jaw flexed. For a second, something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe, or concern. Then it vanished. "You start digging into things that aren't your business," he replied carefully. "You might find yourself in deeper water than you expect." "Deeper than 2 miles offshore?" Michael asked. Silence stretched between them. Shadow shifted slightly, positioning himself between Michael and the sheriff. Not aggressively, but deliberately. Weller glanced down at the dog, then back up. "Just be careful," he said finally. "Not everything that moves through this parish shows up on paper." He turned and walked back toward his truck without another word. Michael watched him go, then looked down at the notebook again. Gregory present. Deep channel operational. Offload window. Daniel had not slipped. He had been watching, recording, interfering, and someone had decided that was unacceptable. Shadow stepped beside him once more and stared toward the water beneath the pier. Michael folded the note carefully and slid it into his jacket. "They weren't just moving cargo," he said under his breath. "They were protecting it." Below them, the tide began to rise again, brushing against the hidden wreck where cables and hooks waited for the next shipment. And in the quiet between waves, one truth settled into place. Daniel Hayes had uncovered the smuggling route beneath his own dock, and someone had silenced him before he could stop it. By late afternoon, the sky had changed color in a way only Gulf storms could manage, turning from dull gray to a bruised green that pressed low over the water. The air thickened until breathing felt like drawing through wet cloth. Michael Hayes stood at the edge of the pier, watching the horizon darken, notebook and map secured inside a sealed plastic bag, tucked beneath loose floorboards in the shed. Shadow paced beside him, tail low, ears shifting constantly as the wind began to coil tighter around the beams. Michael had seen storms like this overseas. Different terrain, same pressure in the air, the quiet before impact. He moved with controlled urgency, tying down what tools he could, reinforcing the outer mooring posts with extra rope. The sheriff's warning echoed faintly in his mind, but it was the tide chart in Daniel's notebook that troubled him more. The deep channel would be at peak access just after midnight, exactly when the storm would hit hardest. "You don't run shipments in clear weather," Michael muttered. "You use chaos." Shadow stopped pacing and stared toward the tree line, nostrils flaring. The dog's injured shoulder had stiffened again in the damp air, but he ignored it. His focus sharpened whenever engines sounded in the distance. The first wave hit the pier just after sunset. Not large, but forceful enough to rattle the boards. Rain followed in sheets, slamming sideways across the dock. The shed roof groaned under the wind. Michael retreated inside and barred the door with a length of pipe. Lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the water in violent flashes. Between thunder rolls, Michael thought he heard something else. An engine, not from shore, from offshore. Shadow's head snapped toward the water. A low vibration hummed through his chest. Michael moved to the doorway and cracked it open just enough to see beyond the rain. At first, only darkness. Then a shape emerged between waves. A low-profile vessel running without navigation lights. It rode the swells with controlled precision, cutting toward the deep channel that passed beneath the pier. "They're using the storm," he breathed. Another flash of lightning revealed two smaller silhouettes behind it. Support boats. Michael turned back inside, heart steady but mind racing. He grabbed the waterproof case from beneath the floorboards and shoved it into his backpack. The map and notebook followed. If they destroyed the pier tonight, the evidence would go with it. A heavy thud struck the outer beam. The entire structure shuddered. Shadow barked once, sharp, commanding. Michael stepped out despite the rain. The large vessel had slowed beyond the channel line, barely visible in the storm's haze. A smaller boat detached and moved closer, not toward open water, toward the pier. Another wave slammed the supports. A crack echoed beneath his feet. Then he saw them, figures in dark, waterproof gear moving along the shoreline toward the base of the pier. Not seeking shelter, moving with intention. Inside, Michael ordered Shadow. The dog did not retreat. Instead, he positioned himself between Michael and the approaching figures. A beam split under pressure. The outer section of the pier tilted violently as a piling gave way. Wood snapped like gunfire. Michael grabbed Shadow's collar and pulled him toward the shed as another wave crashed through the compromised supports. The section of pier nearest the water tore free and twisted sideways, collapsing into the churning tide. In the chaos, two shadowed figures rushed up the remaining boards. One carried a crowbar. The other held something metallic that caught lightning for a split second. They were not here to rescue cargo. They were here for the case. Michael ducked inside the shed just as the first man kicked the door. It splintered inward. Rain flooded across the floorboards. Shadow launched. He struck the first intruder square in the chest, knocking him backward into the wall. The man cursed, swinging the crowbar downward. Shadow twisted, teeth snapping onto the man's forearm. The second figure lunged for the workbench, scanning desperately. "They moved it!" he shouted over the wind. Michael drove his shoulder into the second man, slamming him against the shelving. The man's hood fell back briefly, revealing a narrow face with sharp cheekbones and a thin scar along the chin. Young, late 20s. Eyes hardened by something more than petty crime. The first man managed to wrench free from Shadow's grip and staggered back through the doorway as another massive wave ripped half the remaining pier into the sea. The shed floor began to tilt. "Out!" Michael yelled. He grabbed his backpack and shoved past the second intruder, just as the rear wall of the shed collapsed inward under wind pressure. The men retreated toward the tree line, abandoning the attempt. Their objective had not been the container below. It had been the records. Michael and Shadow ran through mud and pelting rain toward higher ground inland. Behind them, Driftwood Point tore apart under the storm's force. Beams snapped. Boards scattered into the surf. Within minutes, the pier that had stood for decades was reduced to fractured timber. They reached an abandoned seafood warehouse half a mile inland, a structure long unused after a factory fire years ago. Its metal siding rattled violently in the wind, but its foundation remained solid. Michael forced the side door open and pulled Shadow inside. The interior smelled of rust and old brine. Broken crates lay scattered across concrete floors. Rain hammered against the tin roof in relentless waves. Shadow shook himself once, water spraying across the dim interior. Blood from his shoulder mixed with rain along the fur, but he remained standing, alert. Michael set the backpack on an overturned pallet and opened the case. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the loss behind them. The pier was gone. Daniel's livelihood, the last physical piece of family, All of it, he murmured. Gone. But the notebook remained. He unfolded the coastal map beneath the weak beam of his flashlight. The red coordinates offshore aligned with the vessel he had seen in the storm. One marking had a handwritten note beside it in Daniel's script. Primary transfer point. Another marking, farther from shore, circled in darker ink. Mother vessel holds offshore until confirmation. Michael traced the line connecting those points to the deep channel. The smuggling route did not originate at the pier. The pier had simply been the drop site. The real operation lay 2 miles out, beyond standard patrol patterns. Shadow moved closer and lowered himself beside Michael, eyes half-lidded but attentive. They were protecting something bigger, Michael said quietly. The pier was expendable. Thunder rolled again overhead. In the distance, through a crack in the warehouse siding, Michael could just make out faint lights offshore. Stationary now, waiting for calmer water. The storm had destroyed the dock. It had not destroyed the operation. Michael closed the notebook slowly. Daniel had discovered the offshore transfer point, and someone had decided that was worth killing him over. The storm left behind a shoreline that looked rearranged by violence. Driftwood Point was gone, reduced to broken timber scattered along the shallows. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared into a sharp blue that felt almost mocking. Michael Hayes stood outside the abandoned seafood warehouse, staring toward the water where his brother's pier had once stood. Beside him, Shadow sat upright despite the stiffness in his shoulder, coat still damp from salt, but eyes steady and watchful. The dog had not slept much. Neither had Michael. The offshore coordinates from Daniel's notebook pulsed in Michael's mind like a second heartbeat. 2 miles out. Primary transfer point. Mother vessel holds offshore until confirmation. The pier had only been a receiving arm. The body of the operation lay farther out in deeper water. Michael did not own a boat anymore. Daniel's skiff had been destroyed when the pier collapsed. But Earl Beaumont did. And Earl owed the Hayes family more than silence. Michael found him at the marina just before noon. Earl stood beside his 40-year-old trawler, the Mercy Belle, cigarette clamped between thick fingers. He looked older in daylight, shoulders rounded slightly, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. His beard had grown uneven since Michael had last seen him close. He did not look surprised to see Michael approach. "Doc's gone," Earl said quietly. "I know." Earl flicked ash into the wind. "You thinking of leaving?" Michael held his gaze. "I need a ride." Earl's jaw tightened. He had been a stubborn man his whole life, shaped by decades of shrimping and storms that had taken more than boats. His oldest son had drowned during a hurricane 20 years earlier when a faulty engine stalled in rough water. Since then, Earl had believed survival meant staying quiet and staying afloat. 2 miles offshore isn't fishing water, Earl said carefully. "It is if someone's using it," Michael replied. Shadow stood at Michael's side, silent but imposing. Earl studied the dog for a long moment. "That ain't no stray," he muttered. "No," Michael agreed. After a long pause, Earl crushed the cigarette under his boot. 30 minutes, then we turn back." The Mercy Belle groaned to life with a coughing engine that sounded older than its captain. Michael and Shadow climbed aboard. The trawler cut through calm water that felt falsely peaceful after the storm. As they moved farther from shore, the coastline thinned into a distant strip of green and sand. Michael checked Daniel's map against the GPS coordinates on Earl's console. "Another quarter mile," he said. The water here darkened, deeper than the surrounding shallows. No buoys marked the area. No official lanes passed through it. Then Shadow stiffened. He moved toward the bow, ears forward, nostrils wide. His entire posture shifted from cautious to focused. Earl slowed the engine instinctively. At first, the water looked empty. Then Michael saw them. 3 low-profile cargo containers floated partially submerged, tethered to weighted buoys designed to remain just beneath the surface. From a distance, they would appear as random debris. Up close, they were unmistakably deliberate. A smaller speedboat sat idling nearby, unmanned but tethered to one of the buoys. Michael's eyes scanned the horizon. "There," Earl whispered. A larger vessel sat farther out, anchored beyond the visible line of containers. It bore no identifying marks. Its hull was painted matte gray. No flag. No name. Shadow emitted a low rumble in his chest. Michael pulled binoculars from Earl's cabin and focused on the larger vessel. 2 figures moved along the deck. One carried a handheld radio. The other adjusted something near the stern. Equipment mounted low, shielded from casual view. Encrypted communication. Military-grade antenna. "This isn't small-time smuggling," Michael said quietly. Earl's knuckles whitened on the wheel. "You should have sold," he muttered. Michael lowered the binoculars. Daniel wrote that Gregory was present during offloads. Earl flinched at the name. "You know him," Michael said flatly. Earl's jaw worked slowly. "Everyone knows him. He funds half the cleanup projects in this parish, sponsors the school, fixes the roads after storms, and runs a floating warehouse offshore." Earl did not answer. Michael's gaze shifted back to the containers. As he watched, one of the crew members aboard the larger vessel gave a hand signal. The smaller speedboat roared to life and maneuvered toward the floating cargo. 2 men began fastening tow lines to one of the containers. "They're moving it," Michael said. Earl cut the engine immediately, drifting behind a natural swell to avoid detection. Through the binoculars, Michael noticed something else. A second vessel approached from the opposite direction. A parish patrol boat. Official colors. Sheriff's Department insignia. But instead of intercepting, it slowed at a distance and idled. Michael's stomach tightened. "They're escorting," he said under his breath. Earl stared ahead, face drained. "You didn't see that," he murmured. Michael kept watching. The patrol boat maintained a steady parallel line as the speedboat began towing the container toward the deeper channel that once led beneath Driftwood Point. Only now, with the pier destroyed, the drop site would shift. Shadow barked once, sharp, restrained, not panic. Warning. Michael lowered the binoculars slowly. The operation was not hidden chaos. It was coordinated, protected. "Sheriff Weller knew," Michael said quietly. "Maybe not everything, but enough." Earl exhaled shakily. "You think he's the only one?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the patrol boat again. The man at its helm stood tall and rigid in uniform, hands steady on the wheel. Even at distance, Michael recognized the silhouette. Sheriff Tom Weller himself. This was not ignorance. It was complicity. The speedboat completed its tow and looped back toward the larger vessel. The patrol boat adjusted position again, then slowly peeled away as if the job had been completed. Shadow's eyes tracked every movement. The dog's muscles remained taut, absorbing the scene as if cataloging it. Michael lowered himself onto the bench beside Earl. For a moment, neither man spoke. "They burned my brother for this," Michael said finally. Earl swallowed. You go after this alone, you won't last. Michael's mind moved with new clarity now. This was not just a smuggling route. It was a network woven into the town itself. Businesses, law enforcement, charity fronts. Gregory Walsh had not come to buy the dock out of fear. He had come because Daniel's evidence threatened the supply chain. Shadow nudged Michael's hand gently. Michael looked down at him. The indentation around the dog's neck felt heavier in memory now. Tactical collar. Government unit. You recognize the patrol boat, don't you? Michael murmured. Shadow's ears flicked, but his gaze remained locked on the distant vessel. Michael stood slowly. They're not hiding, he said. They're confident. Earl restarted the engine, voice tight. We've seen enough. As the Mercy Belle turned back toward shore, Michael kept his eyes on the offshore vessel shrinking behind them. The containers remained half-submerged, patient, efficient. There was no tunnel beneath the water, no secret underground labyrinth. Just disciplined logistics executed in plain sight by people who believed no one would dare look closely. And the worst truth of all was not the cargo or the encrypted radios. It was the fact that the town had chosen not to see. The decision was made before Michael Hayes admitted it to himself. Watching the offshore transfer had not been enough. He needed proof that could not be dismissed as suspicion. He needed names, recordings, images, something that would survive intimidation and denial. 2 nights after the reconnaissance with Earl, under a moon thin as wire, Michael stood at the edge of the marina with a borrowed aluminum skiff, its engine small but quiet. Shadow stood beside him, shoulder heeling but still stiff, amber eyes reflecting dock lights in sharp glints. You don't have to come, Michael murmured, though he knew the dog would not stay behind. Shadow stepped into the skiff first. The water lay calm but deceptive. The deeper channel ran black beneath the hull as Michael cut the engine and drifted within range of the offshore site. The larger vessel was anchored farther out again, but tonight something new was visible. A rusted metal structure rising slightly above the waterline about a quarter mile from the floating containers. Through binoculars, Michael studied it. An old communications relay station, likely decommissioned years ago. Its skeletal frame stood crooked, antenna bent at an angle, maintenance platform barely above the waves. He remembered reading about coastal monitoring posts that had been abandoned after funding cuts. Perfect cover. They're staging from the station, he muttered. Shadow's posture shifted immediately at the sight of the structure. His breathing slowed, body tightening with a strange familiarity. Michael steered the skiff behind the shadow of the old relay tower and cut the engine completely. The waves lapped softly against the metal supports. Up close, he could see a narrow service ladder descending toward a platform just above the water. A faint red light blinked inside one of the windows. Active power. This was no abandoned ruin. Michael secured the skiff and climbed first, Shadow following with controlled agility despite the injured leg. Inside, the air smelled of salt and machine oil. The interior had been partially refurbished. Portable generators hummed quietly. Military-grade communication equipment lined one wall, screens flickering with encrypted data streams. Michael moved quickly, snapping photos with his phone, capturing images of serial numbers and transmission frequencies. Footsteps echoed from above. He froze. A voice carried down the narrow stairwell. Shift rotation at 0200. Keep it tight. Michael signaled to Shadow with a subtle hand motion. The dog crouched low, body aligned with Michael's left side. They slipped into a side corridor, but a second door at the end of the hall opened abruptly. A man stepped through, tall, lean, mid-30s, with close-cropped blonde hair and a narrow face marked by an old burn scar along the jawline. His eyes were pale blue, sharp and suspicious. He wore dark tactical gear rather than civilian clothing, not dock worker attire, trained security. He saw Michael instantly. "Who the hell are you?" Michael lunged forward, slamming the man against the wall before he could reach his radio. The impact knocked the device loose, but the man recovered quickly, driving his elbow into Michael's ribs. They struggled in tight quarters, boots scraping against metal flooring. Another set of footsteps thundered down the stairs. Shadow reacted first. He launched forward, striking the second approaching guard mid-thigh, teeth clamping down with controlled force. The guard shouted, losing balance. The first man recovered and swung a baton downward. Shadow twisted to intercept, taking the blow across his back instead of Michael's head. The crack of impact echoed in the metal chamber. "Shadow!" The dog staggered but did not retreat. He repositioned instantly, blocking the stairwell. Michael shoved the first man hard into the wall and sprinted toward the rear exit. But it was locked, reinforced steel. No escape that way. The front ladder led back toward the main platform, where at least two more figures moved in shadow. The waves had grown rougher, slamming against the tower supports. Retreat by skiff would be exposed, trapped. Shadow barked once, sharp and directional. Then he turned and darted down a narrow maintenance passage Michael had barely noticed, low and tight along the interior wall. Michael followed. The passage led to a smaller secondary ladder descending toward an auxiliary power unit mounted just above the waterline. The ladder was rusted, but functional. Shadow paused beside a panel halfway down and pawed at it. Michael glanced at it quickly. The panel bore faint stenciling, partially scraped away. Federal Communications Service. Shadow's nose pressed firmly against a seam in the metal casing. Michael's mind clicked into place. This dog had been here before. Not as a stray, as part of an operation. The familiarity in his movements was not instinct. It was memory. Another shout echoed above. Michael yanked open the auxiliary panel. Inside, tangled wiring fed into the primary generator. Old infrastructure patched into newer equipment. "Hold them," he whispered. Shadow climbed 2 rungs up the ladder and positioned himself squarely in the narrow passage, body-blocking entry. His stance was not reckless. It was tactical. The blonde guard lunged into view. Michael slammed the metal panel back into place and ripped 2 primary cables free. Sparks erupted instantly. The generator screamed and shorted, lights flickering violently. The guard charged. Shadow met him head-on. The baton came down again, striking Shadow across the shoulder. The dog faltered this time, legs buckling briefly. Michael could run. The skiff was still below. The storm swell was rising, offering cover, but Shadow was down. Michael turned back without hesitation. He drove his shoulder into the blonde guard, sending both of them crashing into the railing. The metal structure groaned as another wave struck. He grabbed Shadow by the harness indentation at his neck and dragged him toward the ladder. The dog regained footing halfway down, refusing to be carried entirely. Behind them, sparks cascaded as the overloaded generator finally failed. The station plunged into darkness except for faint emergency lighting. Confusion erupted above as crew members shouted over the wind. Michael and Shadow dropped the final feet into the skiff. He cut the tether and pushed off just as another wave crashed against the tower supports. The dark swallowed them. Michael did not start the engine until they were well beyond the station's silhouette. When he finally did, the sound felt too loud in the night, but no pursuit followed. The station remained crippled, lights flickering sporadically as the emergency systems struggled. Shadow lay at Michael's feet, breathing hard but conscious. His amber eyes lifted briefly to meet Michael's. There was no fear in them, only recognition. "You've been here before," Michael said quietly over the engine's hum. "With someone else." Back at the warehouse, Michael cleaned the new bruising along Shadow's back and examined the faded indentation around his neck more closely. Embedded beneath the fur line, almost invisible, was a tiny scar where a microchip implant would sit. He retrieved a small portable scanner from his truck, a tool once used to check livestock IDs. It beeped once. A number appeared. Not a civilian registry code, a federal asset tag. Michael stared at the screen, heart steady again. Shadow was not a stray. He had belonged to a federal K-9 unit. And someone in that unit had investigated the same offshore relay station before disappearing. Michael closed the scanner slowly. Outside, the Gulf wind carried the scent of salt and something metallic. "They thought they could buy silence," he murmured, running a hand gently along Shadow's neck. "They forgot loyalty doesn't work that way." Shadow exhaled softly and rested his head against Michael's boot. The morning after the relay station went dark, the Gulf lay strangely still, as if exhausted by its own violence. Michael Hayes sat inside the abandoned warehouse with Shadow resting at his feet, the federal asset number still glowing faintly in his mind. He had not slept. Instead, he had organized everything: photos from the station, serial numbers from the communication arrays, GPS coordinates, images of the offshore containers, Daniel's notebook pages, and the map marked in red. He knew one thing with clarity now. Local channels were compromised. Sheriff Weller's patrol boat had not been coincidence. Gregory Walsh had not been bluffing. This required escalation beyond parish lines. Michael drove 3 hours inland to a federal field office in Baton Rouge. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, gaze steady on the road ahead, shoulder wrapped but healing. The building they entered was modern and sterile, glass reflecting sky and flag. The officer who met them introduced herself as Special Agent Rebecca Sloan. She was in her early 40s, tall and composed, with dark brown hair pulled tightly into a bun at the nape of her neck. Her posture was military straight despite the plain suit she wore. A thin scar crossed the knuckle of her left hand, subtle but noticeable. Her eyes were sharp gray, the kind that missed little and trusted less. Years in federal service had carved restraint into her expression. "You're alleging a protected offshore smuggling route with local law enforcement involvement," she summarized after reviewing the first batch of images. "I'm not alleging," Michael replied evenly. "I'm showing you." Shadow remained seated beside him, calm but observant. Rebecca's gaze lingered briefly on the dog's posture. "You ran the asset number?" she asked. Michael slid the scanner results across the desk. Rebecca's expression shifted, barely. She stood and left the room without explanation. 10 minutes later, she returned with a second man. He was older, mid-50s, broad-shouldered, though slightly stooped from years of desk duty. His name was Assistant Director Mark Halpern. His hair was steel gray, cropped close, his jaw square and clean-shaven. His voice carried quiet authority, the tone of someone accustomed to command without raising volume. "Where did you find this K9? Halpern asked. "Under my brother's pier," Michael replied. Halpern studied Shadow closely. "Asset K-17, he said softly. "Assigned to Special Agent Ethan Cole." The name settled into the air like weight. Rebecca folded her arms. "Agent Cole went missing 11 months ago during an independent probe into suspected maritime trafficking." "Independent?" Michael asked. "Off the books," Halpern clarified. "Internal tips suggested local compromise." Michael's jaw tightened. "My brother was looking into the same route." Rebecca nodded once. Cole believed shipments were being staged through abandoned coastal infrastructure before inland distribution. "He stopped transmitting the same week your brother died." Shadow rose slowly and stepped closer to Halpern, nose lifting toward the man's hand. Halpern knelt slightly, examining the dog's eyes with professional familiarity. "He stayed behind," Halpern murmured. "After Cole vanished, the unit assumed K-17 was lost at sea." Shadow did not flinch. He held Halpern's gaze steadily. Michael spoke quietly. "He wasn't lost. He was guarding something." Within 48 hours, federal vessels surrounded the offshore relay station. Michael watched from a safe distance as marked ships replaced unmarked silhouettes. The larger gray mother vessel was intercepted beyond the transfer zone. Containers were seized, crew members detained. News traveled fast once it broke. Gregory Walsh was arrested on charges of conspiracy and federal trafficking violations. Sheriff Weller was taken into custody under suspicion of obstruction and collusion. Several town officials were questioned. The network, once silent and confident, fractured under scrutiny. Rebecca Sloan returned to the warehouse 2 days later with formal confirmation. "Ethan Cole is confirmed deceased," she said evenly. "Recovered remains were located beneath the relay station's lower chamber during sweep operations." Michael felt something settle inside him. Not relief, not vengeance, but completion. Rebecca knelt beside Shadow. "He stayed," she said softly. "He waited for someone who would continue." Halpern stepped forward and placed a document on a crate. "Asset K-17 is officially retired as of today. No further operational assignment." Michael looked down at Shadow. The dog's amber eyes reflected no confusion, no anticipation, only presence. Halpern spoke again, voice steady. "He no longer belongs to the Bureau. He belongs wherever he chooses to stay." Shadow turned, walked directly to Michael, and sat at his side. Michael rested his hand gently on the dog's head. "Then you're staying with me." Weeks passed. Driftwood Point no longer existed in Wood, but the shoreline remained. Federal restitution funds were allocated after seizures from the trafficking ring. Instead of leaving town, Michael used the compensation to rebuild. Not the same pier, but something stronger. He constructed a reinforced dock farther up the channel, engineered with steel pilings and open access points for inspection. A modest workshop rose beside it, painted in clean white and blue. Above the door hung a new sign, Hayes Coastal Repair and Rescue. The first month, only 2 boats came. Both belonged to fishermen who had once avoided him. Earl Beaumont was one of them. The older man removed his cap awkwardly when he stepped onto the new dock. "Should have spoken up sooner," Earl admitted quietly. "I was scared." Michael nodded. "You're here now." Word spread slowly, then faster. Sarah Delgado organized supply donations for the workshop. Volunteers helped rebuild storage sheds. A small fenced area behind the dock became a refuge for abandoned dogs found along the marsh roads. Shadow moved among them calmly, not dominant, but guiding. He corrected gently, disciplined with quiet authority. Children from town began visiting in the afternoons. They watched repairs, listened to stories about tides and engines. Fear that once hung over the shoreline dissipated under steady work and transparency. Lights lined the new dock each evening, bright and deliberate. No more dark corners, no more hidden channels. One late afternoon, as the sun lowered into a wash of gold over the Gulf, Michael stood at the edge of the rebuilt structure. Boats bobbed quietly in safe moorings. Laughter drifted from the workshop, where volunteers finished painting a skiff for a widowed shrimper who could not afford repairs. Shadow stood beside him, coat healthy now, muscles restored, scar barely visible beneath thick fur. They did not stand there because survival required it. They stood because they had chosen it, because loyalty had outlasted fear, because silence had finally been broken. Michael looked toward the horizon where the offshore waters once concealed a protected route of greed and corruption. Now patrol vessels marked legitimate lanes, and communication towers transmitted openly. "Some things sink," he said quietly. "Truth doesn't." Shadow's tail moved once in the warm evening breeze, and along a shoreline once ruled by secrecy, light replaced shadow, not by force, but by refusal to abandon what mattered. This story was never only about a pier, or smuggling, or even justice. It was about a man who had every reason to walk away, and chose to stay. It was about a dog who could have disappeared into the wild, and chose loyalty instead. Together, they proved that darkness survives only when good people stay silent. When one person stands up, others find the courage to follow. A broken dock became a stronger foundation. Fear became community. Silence became truth. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as lightning from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a second chance, a loyal companion, or the strength to do what is right when no one is watching. Perhaps that is how God works in our lives, not always removing the storm, but guiding us through it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to join this journey of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, and bring peace to your heart. Thank you for being here.